And welcome to another FHIR for Developers tutorial video. My name is Gino Canessa, and today we are starting video 3 on our FHIR Search extravaganza. Today we're going to talk about search result parameters, which affect the contents you're getting back, not what you're searching for, but what the server actually returns to you. As always, there's a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. As has become normal for this series, I'm going to start on the FHIR Search page. Again, there's a lot of information here, so I hope it's been pretty useful to break it down into these pieces. We're going to start with this summary table today, since we've been here a couple times and this is hopefully more familiar at this point. In the first set, we talked about just standard parameters, search parameters. These are just search terms. You can search for an ID, you can search for when something was last updated. These are the ones that are generically defined, not necessarily always supported, but at least generically defined. And then you can use these the same way that you use, a patient birth date or a patient name that you're searching for. In the second video, we talked about the search parameter types. And so how you format strings, numbers, date times, all those different things. How you can do ranges, for instance, looking for a date within a range or outside of a range, how you can do multiple terms and or them together, things like that. And so now we get to focus on this third box, the search result parameters. So as we said, these are parameters that change the shape of the data you're getting back. Sometimes it's the elements that are there, sometimes it's the ordering, some different things like that. It'll make more sense as we go through and try it. So let's start with the top of the list. Actually, is one of the most intuitive ones to start with because it is sorting. You can see there's a parameter that's just named _sort, and it has a comma-separated list of rules, and they are in priority order. So that means we can put multiple values, and the order we put them in is the order they'll be applied. So that way, equivalent status things in this case will be sorted then by date, and if they have the equivalent status and dates, they'll be sorted by category. And then if there's nothing else, any more ties will just be in whatever order the server put them in. We can see here it's, again, comma separated, and it does note here that we have an optional minus prefix, which it used here on the date, which is to say if you want it in decreasing or descending order instead of the default ascending order. Great, so what are these fields? Generally speaking, they're search parameters. And so, again, there's a lot more descriptive text down here, and then servers will vary on which ones they actually want to support or not. There's a lot of discovery things that are possible but not very common. So generally speaking, if you have a sort that you want to apply, one of the easiest things to do is try it and see. But overall, if a search parameter is supported by the server, then often the sort parameter would be as well. So what does it look like in practice? Well, here we can say our name is test, and we want to sort by birth date, for instance. So when we try and run this, you can see that one took a little while. Again, as we're adding more qualifications here, as we're adding more parameters here, like sorting or filtering, we're asking the server to do more work. So expect your queries would take a little longer. There's some things that it might make sense to just do on your client, so you're not overloading a server, and some things that make a lot more sense to do on the server. So there'll be that balancing game that you play when you're doing things in production, but this should give, those are the kinds of things that you need to test for later. So in this case, we said we're just going to ask for patients who have test, again, a name that begins with test, a family name, a given name, whatever piece. And we want to sort those records by birth date. So if we start going, we can see kind of our first record is January 1st of the year 1. That is a very reasonable first record to have. And then they keep going up again with kind of made up dates until eventually we start at least getting into modern documented history. So You can see we can just sort that way, and if we want to, we can just put this minus in the front, and now we have, whenever this comes back, took again a little time because the server has more work to do, and now we can see when we search for birth dates, these are actually in the future, so 22, 26, and then as we keep going, 2023, 22, 21, and actual time in the past now. So we can see we can sort ascending or descending, and same thing, we can just keep adding fields with commas and everything else the way we have before. So that is sorting. There's a little bit more here. You can use this score, but that's, again, another parameter that you can use for a relevance matching on a server. But again, that's going to be implementation dependent. I'm going to generally just go in order here, just for simplicity. The next one here is count. And I'll note this title page count is very misleading. It is not a page count. It is for the number of resources in a single page. So this is your way of saying as a client, I'm in a very constrained environment. I'm working on an embedded device. I'm working, with very low resources, and I can only handle at most 5 results on a single page. So again, it's a little unfortunate that this heading is page count. We'll file a ticket for that if we haven't already. I need to go search, but that's what we're trying to, this parameter does, is it just says, hey, there's really only return a very reduced set. Another thing you can think of is if you're just saying, I want to show the first 5 results to my client, and I'll let them page through if they're interested in more, things like that. And those are, you can see a lot of use cases where you would want that. In this case, there's actually a note too, that if you sort and count, it's a good way to just get the most recent. So if you're just saying, I want to show the most recent 1 or 2 encounters, I may not know what those are, but it's very easy for me to just say, oh yeah, I just need the top 2 because that's all I can display in my UI, and that's all I'm going to ask for. So there we go, that's count. And now, while I said I was going to go in order, relatively in order, these are the ones that I'm going to skip, include and rev include, and those, because they're going to need their own video when we talk about chaining and including and reverse including and things like that. Probably coming up shortly. So if we skip that, we head to summary. Summary is the first one that's changing the contents of the resources we're getting back. And if you've been playing around in FHIR and some of these other videos, it makes more sense if we look at a resource here. You've probably come across summary things already. And this is this sigma summary flag that is on any given element within a resource. And that's just saying this is an element that's included in summaries. So if you were, for instance, getting a summary of a patient, not a summary of a patient record, just the summary of the patient itself, you would want their name, maybe their telecom, contact points, things like that. You don't need to know if they were multiple births. You don't need to know about all of their communication languages or their general practitioners or things like that. That's not what you would display in a summary of a patient. And it's the same thing if we go and look at, for instance, encounter. Just as another, again, resource that's pretty familiar to people, you can see that there's always things like the identifier. You don't need the whole history. If you're looking at an encounter, you don't need to see every step of the way as it was scheduled and when they arrived and when they checked in and when they left. You just need to see the current state and things like that. So as resources are being defined, these flags get added, and then that's what controls that here in the summary view. So you can see this is just a parameter that we give, and here we list, or it is listed, what the valid values are: true, text, data, count, and false, with a pretty good description of each. What does it look like in practice? Well, let's go ahead and grab a test patient, and we'll just do one of these. so that we can grab someone here and someone that has some data here. Sure, this looks like a great. We want someone that has at least a birth date as well. There we go. So this way we can grab an ID of a patient that has some info. And so again, we talked about this before. This is the kind of thing that you want to do. You want to be able to search by ID because we're just getting the one result. So we could, if we just wanted this patient, we could just do this get. And you can see we got the patient resource. But if we want things like the summary view of the patient, we need to do a search. And so in this case, we can say summary is true. When we do that, we still get the bundle with the one result, but now this resource has been filtered. Things that aren't in the summary view are not present in this result. Important note about that. Because it has modified and filtered out some data, the server went ahead and tagged this response, saying that it's been subsetted. And here the display is a nice description of why. And in this case, it's saying that it was requested in summary mode. So this tag, in this case, the server is applying it to both the resource itself. So you can see in resource, so in the patient.meta, and it's in the bundle. So in the bundle.meta, that tag is also present. They're trying to put it in as many places as they can to show it. Some servers, some implementations will put it in one, the other, both. Hopefully not neither, because that's very important that they put that there. And again, the thought is you don't want to be using this patient record, this resource, as a full record, because there are fields that the server has that are missing, or at least there may be, as far as we know. I'm not sure if this patient actually has things that have been removed, but just generally speaking, when you ask for a summary view, they're going to add this tag. So we can see that's pretty good. That's a good, reasonable set of information back. But we have a few other options here that we can use on summary. And I'm going to try to avoid flipping back and forth quite so much as we go through these, because it's a little easier for me to just look at them here. But I'm just going to go down the list here through some of these options so we can see what they look like. The text element is an interesting one, and same thing. You can see that we have this resource. We still have the one result. We're going by ID, so these are all going to be the same patient record. We're just getting different views of the data. So again, it's been subsetted. We know the server has gone and modified this record, and this is not a complete record that we want to use. And in this case, it's pretty obvious because other than the meta, which is just that kind of information, we have ID and we have text. Oops, ID and text. And so this text element is actually a property of domain resource. So every resource that you're going to be using realistically has it. And this is just an XHTML summary of the resource itself. So in this case, we can see this is a text that was generated by the server. So whenever someone created this resource, they did not include a text. And so the server went and tried to do a reasonable summary of what that looks like. And you can see it has the patient's name, it has their address, date of birth, things like that. And so this is just a textual view of essentially a lot of the summary data. That's what the server used to build this. But you can see this is very small. So if you can use this, if you're just displaying a list and saying, okay, if you click on something, you're going to go further in, this is a great way to get it because it's a very small amount of data comparatively. So much smaller amount of data, but again, it's XHTML, which may or may not be useful to you, and you don't have any control over what's in here because this is done either by whoever created it or updated the resource. You can ask for the opposite of that, the inverse. So if we ask for summary data, now we're getting everything from the patient except that text. So same thing as we were talking about before. If you're especially in a very constrained environment and you're worried about how much data is coming across the wire, you can get rid of those pieces, those fragments of text. If you're on a native mobile client or embedded device. You're never using XHTML, you're never displaying any of it, you just need the elements from the resource. This will reduce the amount of data being transferred, and you don't have to worry about receiving it, parsing it, etc. Now there is the offset that we're adding this subsetted tag. So if every resource is tagged with this, how much data are you saving? Unless they're very long summaries, probably not a lot. But again, that's going to be use case dependent. Now, one of the most clear of how it's changing things are actually when you change summary to count. So in this case, what we actually ask the server to do is just give us the number. We're not interested in any of the resources. We're doing something like displaying how many encounters this patient has, how many medications the patient has, how many patients a physician has in their care, things like that. We'll get the details later, but for right now, we're just interested in the count if we did them. Now again, the server has to actually process this and do it. So this is relatively fast because it's not actually retrieving records, it's just getting counts. So if there's very large queries and things like that expected, this can help. But you know, you want to be careful about just, oh, before I do every query, I'm going to go get the counts and things like that, because we are doing an extra round trip and everything else. The last option here is actually setting this to false. And I'll just do it just for fun. But what this actually does is turn off the summary, and it's the same as, oops, there we go. It's the same as not including it at all. So again, this is the same thing. We're just saying there's no summary. Don't use the summary parameter to change anything. So these next two, total and elements, are actually pretty well related to how summary works. I'll jump into total because it's the fastest. And these are just hints about asking the server for that same number here. So we have total 1. Again, this field here in the bundle where it says the total number of records, that's optional for the servers to fill out. So in the case of 1, you know, the server is pretty happy to do it. But same thing, if we go name equals test, I think this one, yes. So you can see that field is gone. And we did see some of that behavior when we were talking about the search parameters in general. The reason being, this server includes the number if it's, I believe it's set to something like less than 500. So yes, so you can see, in this case, since we asked for the exact name of test, it gave us a total of 306 because it knew that number is less than 500, so it just figures out that whole set. However, we may need, this is really the query that the user asked for, and we really would like to know how many are here. So what we can do is ask for total accurate. And in this case, the server is going to honor it and tell us that we have a little over 2,300 records here. Now, it's important to note, and there's notes about this in here, these are hints from the client. They're kind of just requests. The server can use them or not. This field is still optional. They can't dictate how every implementation does these things because that's a little too high of a bar. So if you ask for the accurate number, the client's requesting that the server gives it. Hopefully it does. It may or may not. You can ask for an estimate. And again, some implementations will have things like, oh yeah, this is roughly 500, roughly 1,000, roughly 1,500. Or, you know, when you start getting into large scale, you know, it's roughly 2 million records, things like that. And then none is, I don't need the field here, so don't worry about putting it. Now I'll note, you know, same thing, if we come back here and put the exact, and we say total is none, in this case, again, this server, if it's less than 500, it just gives us the number. And so it will put it, even though we said as a client we're not going to use this number, the server's like, yeah, that's fine, but I'm still going to put it because that's perfectly there, perfectly allowed. So that is total. The other one, jumping back to how kind of summary worked, is this elements field. And this is kind of a fine-grained view like summary was. And this is just a way of saying, essentially, here's a parameter, and we put comma-separated list of elements that should be included. So if we come back to patient, we can see that these things here are the elements. So we've talked about it before, but we can go and use these by name. So same thing, if we say our name is exactly test, we can go and say, and for instance, I'm just putting a list. And so I want to do, I want to have the name and the birth date. Now, I'll note as I'm doing that, I did an error here on purpose. And that is, if we'll look here, we'll see we have names, but no birth dates. The reason being that here we are using element names, not search parameter names. So in a lot of these things, we've been using search parameters, but now we have to use the element names. So if we go back and look, we've highlighted this before in patient, there is a search parameter called birth date, all lowercase. But if we look at the actual element on the resource, it is birth dates in camel case, capital D. And so in this case, since we had asked for the lowercase birth date, the server said, sure, I will include any element with the lowercase birth date. There weren't any. It's the same thing if I came here and said, hello world. Does it let me put an underscore? I don't even remember. It does. And so any element that happened to be named hello world would also be included. So we're not going to see an error for doing that, but we're not going to get the data we expected. In this case, if we go and fix the casing, we can see now that we do have, again, we still have this subset tag because we asked for just a few elements out of the resource. But you can see now we have names and we will have birth dates on ones that have birth dates. And just to jump, back, if we said we always want to have birth dates, we're only looking for patients that have them, we can always add something like birth date, and we'll add the missing modifier, and we'll say false, so it's not missing. So again, here is a lowercase birth date, all lowercase, because we're using the search parameter. And then we're just asking for ones that are not missing their birth date. So now every record will have a birth date as well. So we'll have the 20 of those. And you can mix and match these things. We can come back and add for sorting on these elements and things like that. Yeah. There we go. Perfect. So we can see that that's how you use elements. Apologies there. Perfect. So this will let you get very fine-grained control. So if you're doing things like listing things for clients, you have a UI and you want, you only have enough room, for instance, on a mobile phone to have their name, birth date, gender, even less than you have in the summary. You still have the ID. Those things are always returned. And so you can say, yeah, here's the IDs. That way I can go get the full record when I need. But all I want is the name and the birth date, and that's enough for me to display, add, gender, etc. I think it's just gender, something like that. There you go. And so now we have, a reasonable amount of data. You can even say if they have a photo, include the photo. And you can see how it builds pretty quickly, the amount of data we're looking at. But this is why you can get some pretty long, shrink this for a second. This is how you start getting these very long URLs. And so that's one of the reasons people often like to switch to post, is because then we don't have to worry about building super long URLs. In our case, this tool would let us, if we want to, do things like this so that we can put them one per line. But we're not going to get too long, so I'm not going to worry about it here. but you can do that. So that is elements. And yeah, just here's this note, and that's why the summary table isn't a full listing. So I definitely recommend not just using the summary table, but going through here. And you can see that there's things talking about the relevance that we talked about the scoring. So you can see how relevant it thinks the data is, things like that. All right, contained and contained type. Probably we need to do another whole series if we're going to talk about contained resources. But essentially, every resource has this ability to contain something else. In practice, the rule is that you only contain something that doesn't have enough data to stand by itself. So you can't say, you're not supposed to say, here's my patient and I'm going to insert all of my encounters into it. Those aren't supposed to be contained resources. Those should be just resources that we're linking back and forth to and things like that. But, for instance, you might have an ambulatory encounter that you don't have enough information to actually record a patient in your system. And so in that case, you might identify that by putting a contained resource in the encounter, saying, this is the information we have. It's not enough to make our patient record, and we're just going to keep it self-contained. And then when we update the encounter, that we create a patient and update this encounter to point at it, we'll change it. There are other times that happens more commonly. Some of the medication administrations and formulations and things like that, that there's a few pieces of data, more than you could reasonably put in an extension, that it's not just one or two fields, but not enough to have its full resource. It just doesn't have enough information to do that. So in those situations when you're doing that, then this is how you can search for things. So what we're saying is, for instance, here you can see it's looking at a medication request, and then it's looking for a contained medication that has an ingredient code of ABC. So again, if we just go here and look at medication request, we can see that there's the contained, as there are in every resource that inherits from domain resource, and there is nothing here that says anything about a medication. And that's because the idea being, if you have a medication request but don't have that medication in your system, you'll just create a contained medication that has this given ingredient code. So you can see how you would search inside there, kind of nesting. Searching linked resources is chaining, and that we'll get into probably in the next video segment. Just looking at time and thinking we're probably not going to get to it here. And contain type is the same thing. We're saying that you might be looking, there you go, this is a typed one and this is an untyped one. And so here they're talking about the contain type, so that you can only search for things that have, you want to only find medications that have a contained, or medication requests that have a contained medication, things like that. Yeah, I will note these other ones here because they're pretty similar. And again, we've talked about them before, but the format and pretty are kind of similar to the search result parameters in that you're changing what you're getting back. In this case, the format is what you can say, yes, override and give me XML or JSON. And the pretty is whether you want it condensed or expanded for nice human reading. So that kind of covers the search result parameters that we can use. Again, excluding include and rev include, because in the next segment, we will get into how chaining works, so we can search additional resources, and that will pair well with actually including them in the responses, which is what rev include and include are for. So with that, I think that's a great stopping point. And again, questions or comments, please reach out and let me know. If this helps, please like, subscribe, etc. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.